Hi there. So, the policy that I chose to research and discuss for this video is the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. So, to start off, I went to the United Nations Climate Change website just to get a general explanation of what the Paris Agreement is, what the goal of it is, how they're trying to achieve that goal. So, what I found is that the goal of the Paris Agreement is to lower or limit global warming and lower greenhouse gas emissions. And how they want to do that is by countries submitting nationally determined contributions, which is basically an outline of their plan for climate action. So, the steps that they're going to take to limit greenhouse gas emissions. And these countries set their own targets for their NDCs, and developed countries contribute to developing countries. So I found that the total amount of money that comes from this agreement is $115.9 billion from all of those developed countries going to the developing countries. That number I found from the Organization for Economic, Cooperation and Development. Um, and under the Obama administration, the US pledged $3 billion for this agreement. So, the first question that came to my mind when I was researching this and when I first started was how are we ensuring that these developing countries are actually following through with their steps and reaching their target goals? How are we tracking that? And how are they reporting that evidence? And I found that the Paris Agreement relies heavily on a transparency framework. So, in my eyes, that's just kind of hoping that these developing countries are doing what they're saying and following through. And that made me a little skeptical of the agreement. And I kind of think that it might be a good thing that the United States, withdrew from the agreement. But I do believe that it is the responsibility of all of the countries globally to work together to lower these greenhouse gas emissions and limit global warming. I think that is pretty standard, not a crazy thing to say. Um, However, I just am skeptical about how effective this agreement truly is when we're just basically handing money to these countries and hoping that they're actually taking it and using it to um, better those emissions, right? I mean, we're talking about a lot of money here, so I believe that there should be more regulations to really assure that these developing countries are actually um, following through with what they're saying. And if they're not reaching their target, there should be consequences, it's a lot of money. But it did kind of get me thinking what could be done instead. And so I started researching what the leading cause of carbon emissions is in developing countries. And one that I found is using fossil fuels for energy production. So a lot of these developing countries are using fossil fuels for cooking, transportation, and electricity. And a big example of this is people in those countries using fossil fuels such as wood or charcoal they're burning that to cook their food. And the reason why they're using these fossil fuels is because they're a lot cheaper and more easily accessible and available than renewable energies. However, I was thinking about with the total amount of money, $115.9 billion, instead of just dividing that money to the countries and kind of, again, hoping that they're actually following through with their climate change actions, contributing renewable energy infrastructure. So, wind power and solar energy infrastructure that we can put there, and we have more of the technology to set up and get that running properly to lower carbon emissions. I think that maybe that could be a more effective way to actually ensure that things are being done. I think the transparency framework is kind of what threw me off with the agreement. So all in all, I think it's not a terrible thing that we withdrew, as the United States withdrew from the agreement. However, I do think more should be done to really ensure that the greenhouse gas emissions are being lowered and we are limiting global warming. So, thanks for listening.